Child welfare professionals are seeing a drop in the number of child abuse cases reported in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. The National Children's Alliance says it served 30,000 fewer children at its child advocacy centers in the first 6 months of this year than in the same period last year. Children's advocacy centers are facilities that coordinate child abuse investigations for some of the cases reported to law enforcement and child protective services. The National Children's Alliance is a membership organization that includes 900 such centers across the U.S. National Children's Alliance Executive Director Teresa Huizar is joining us now to talk more about these statistics. So, Teresa, here's the thing about the statistics is you hear, well, there's been a drop in the number of children served or in the number of cases being investigated, but that's actually really scary because it means there are situations that you are never hearing about.
That's right. We have no reason to believe that child abuse has actually dropped. We know that most child abuse cases come from within the family and other loved ones that are close to the children. So when kids have been sort of locked at home during the lockdowns and shutdowns this spring, and also just less contact in school with mandatory reporters, we have every reason to believe that those 30,000 children that we would expect to see were in fact abused. We just don't know who they are or where they are, and then we can't help them until we do.
So many parents have lost their jobs during the pandemic, as you know. What impact does economic insecurity have on instances of child abuse?
Well, we absolutely know that the more that families are stressed, the more there can be lashing out at kids within the family. And that's just a part of the dynamic of domestic violence in general, is that you see that. So when there are increased rates of joblessness, increased rates of hunger, those types of things, one can really tragically expect that. And I think it's why it's so incredibly important that our economy gets back to work, in part so that those physical abuse rates and domestic violence rates will drop because families will have less stress.
What are some of the challenges when it comes to investigating reports of child abuse during a pandemic like this? How have people at the children's advocacy centers tried to do things a little bit differently? I know obviously part of the problem is these children are not in contact with those individuals who it's mandatory for them to report child abuse. So they're not even seeing these children. But how do you even get around that then?
Well, children's advocacy centers and their law enforcement and CPS partners, I think, have been incredibly innovative in trying to make sure we get to as many kids as we can. And so while many businesses were shut down during the pandemic, CACs, children's advocacy centers, pivoted to figure out how to serve these kids remotely. And so during the lockdowns, when kids couldn't come physically to children's advocacy centers, the CACs came to them using teleforensic interviewing and telemental health and those types of things. So we didn't look at that as an excuse to say, well, we're going to forget about these incredibly important children. We said, how can we use technology to do this different? And I really think that those staff who work at children's advocacy centers, the law enforcement investigators and CPS investigators, are the heroes in this story in terms of being right on the front lines throughout the pandemic. And in fact, in many cases, we're still making home visits and other things to make sure that these kids could be safely interviewed and safely receive medical and mental health services throughout the pandemic, and are doing so right now. Right now, there are children walking through the door of a children's advocacy center. We're taking temperatures. We're following safety guidance to make sure they can be safely seen. So, we're here for those kids, and if your viewers will report abuse that they suspect and see, we'll make sure that we're there for those children and families, and we care for them.
That's an important piece of advice. According to the U.S. Health Department, from 2018, about 17% of the children investigated nationally were found to be victims of abuse or neglect. The remaining 83% of children investigated were found to be non-victims or received an alternative response. Is there concern that potential cases are being reported too often?
Oh, I think that people often get confused about what it means for a case to be substantiated or unsubstantiated. It means that it has to reach a certain legal threshold of evidence for that case to proceed. It doesn't mean that it did or didn't happen. And the reason that that's important to think about is that many, many children are simply too young to tell us what happened. So, for example, most child abuse fatalities happen to kids between 0 and 3. So often there are cases that are unsubstantiated, leading up to that fatality, because tragically, we didn't know what was going on in that home. But it doesn't mean the prior reports were false. So no, I don't think the problem is that folks are not reporting enough. I think the problem is that your average citizen really isn't sure what to do when they suspect abuse. And so they don't understand that if they call and they ask a child abuse professional, a CPS investigator, or call 911 and talk to law enforcement, they're doing the absolute right thing to let the professionals scan and ask them questions and try to get the facts. And it's not the job of your average citizen to investigate abuse. We should leave that to the professionals. Make the call if you suspect it, and we'll sort out what has happened.
I want to ask you a question that is not specific to this time. There have been several studies over the years that indicate that there is racial disproportionality in the reports of child abuse cases. I don't know if you call it an over-reporting, but increased cases that have to do with African American children, Native American children. How does the mandatory reporting system that I had brought up before, which is certain people, it's the law that they report abuse. How does that play a role in that? And then we'll fold in the pandemic. What impact could the pandemic have on those statistics?
Well, first of all, I think all of us have to acknowledge that implicit bias is real. And we may not even be aware that it's part of our decision making, but it can be. And so we have to be vigilant about that at every step along the process, both in terms of in the decisions to make a report and whether we think something is concerning or not, but also in the cases that get selected for investigation, making sure that implicit bias isn't guiding those decisions, and in making sure that what we do with cases once they are investigated, we're not having some effective bias in that. One of the exciting, I think, developments in the field has been the use of looking at big data and analytics to help us tease out things like that. And researchers are doing and developing and partnering with Child Protective Services in a number of states to pilot that as a way to try to reduce the effect of bias in the system by saying, okay, what can we see in big sets of data about what makes families most at risk for placement or most at risk for continuing abuse? And let's make sure that we're not screening people in because of some underlying bias that doesn't meet that criteria. So while we haven't made as much progress as we should, and we have a long way to go in the system in regard to this, and we have to be careful about it and aware of this sort of pervasive effects of bias in the system, what I feel good about is that there's now, and is one that we need to address. We're no longer putting our heads in the sand about it. In regard to the pandemic, what I am most concerned about for kids of color is that, just like in every other aspect of the pandemic, they've been disproportionately impacted by it. Health outcomes are worse. We are more worried that for kids who may come into the system, there may not be enough system support for them. And we're also concerned that basic needs are not being addressed. Who are the most likely kids in this country to be hungry? It's kids of color. Who are the most likely kids to be directly affected by poverty? It's kids of color. So I think we have to see that our country has a serious problem in these disparities, and we have to keep talking about it and doing more than talking about it by addressing it, because these kids are particularly vulnerable, and we owe them the same kind of care we give every single child in America.
And Teresa, I feel like that we could dive into that on another day. We should have you back on. As you were talking, I just thought of actually another question that I just want to throw at you. You know, a number of school districts have found it challenging to keep track of kids that are doing remote learning, and there's always sort of a certain percentage of kids who just have never logged on. Maybe they didn't log on in the spring, and they're still, you know, they're trying to find them now. We've also seen sort of a handful of stories of teachers who had been doing remote learning and noticed something happening in the background that looked abusive or criminal or like neglect. I'm wondering if this current time also is giving you additional information about how children are living that you wouldn't have before, because these sort of online Zoom sessions are giving you this tiny little window into their world that many people would not have seen.
Oh, you raised some really fantastic points there. For one thing, it points out the digital divide. And many of these children who have not logged on, it's not that they don't want to, it's that they live in parts of the country in which the access to the internet is very, very limited or non-existent. And I think, speaking of disparities, this country has to address that. And we've seen Congress paying more attention to that issue, but it should be an absolute front burner issue. Every child in America deserves a quality education, and we shouldn't simply say, oh, too bad those kids didn't log in, or too bad those kids didn't have access. They deserve a quality education, and we should get it to them. The other thing that I would just say about this is you're absolutely right. And children's advocacy centers around the country are working very closely with teachers now to help train them in what to look for in these online interactions, because while we know that's not the same as being face-to-face with a child, or having a child catch you in the hallway or disclose right after class in a private moment in the classroom, there are things that can be noticed. And if people are interested in learning more about the signs of abuse, they can go to our website at nationalchildren'salliance.org to learn more about that, because not only can teachers pay more attention that way, but also grandparents who are FaceTime with their kids, their grandkids, and neighbors can find out more simply by seeing kids on the street. Pay attention. That's my advice. If you're an adult in America, it's your job to pay attention to the children in your life to make sure that they're safe.
Such important information, Teresa. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. We really appreciate it. We got really in depth in this, and I think it's important for our viewers. Thank you.